The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, turning the quiet road into a blinding white maze. The young man gripped the wheel of his truck, his eyes squinting through the windshield as the thick snowflakes whipped against the glass. His old truck groaned in protest, struggling against the icy road. He'd been driving for hours, hoping to make it back home before the storm worsened. But now it seemed like the storm was winning, and his plans were slipping away with each mile. He knew the road well. It was the same route he took whenever he needed to get to town, but today it felt different. The snow was heavier than usual and the wind was biting. Visibility was barely a few feet ahead of him and he had to slow down. The snow piled up in thick layers, making the road more slippery with every passing minute. As he rounded a sharp curve, his headlights caught something unusual. At first he thought it was a pile of snow, but as he got closer, the shape became clearer. A car was stuck in the snowbank on the side of the road. Its tires spun uselessly in the deep snow. The man's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if anyone was in the car, but he didn't want to take any chances. He pulled his truck to a stop behind the stranded vehicle, the engine sputtering as he turned it off. He grabbed his coat and opened the door. The cold air hit him like a slap, and he quickly zipped up his jacket, shielding his face from the wind. He walked toward the car, his boots crunching in the snow. As he got closer, he saw an elderly man sitting behind the wheel, staring out the window with a blank expression. The old man's face was pale, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as if he was trying to hold on to something. Anything in the middle of the storm. The young man knocked on the window, careful not to startle him. The elderly man looked up, his eyes wide and glassy. He rolled down the window just a little, enough for the young man to speak. "Hey there," the young man said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Need some help?" The elderly man nodded slowly, his face lined with worry. "I'm stuck," he replied in a voice that trembled from both the cold and fear. "I've been here for hours and no one's come by." The young man glanced around. The snowstorm had swallowed up the road and there was no sign of any other cars. He wasn't sure how long the old man had been sitting there, but it was clear that he was cold and tired. The young man could feel the urgency growing inside him. He couldn't leave this man alone out here in the middle of nowhere, not in this storm. "Don't worry, I'll help you get out of here," the young man said, trying to sound reassuring. He wasn't sure how, but he couldn't just leave. The elderly man smiled weakly, his face looking even older in the dim light. "Thank you. I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't come." The young man nodded and then got to work. He walked to the back of the car and tried to push, but it was no use. The car was buried too deep in the snow, its wheels spinning aimlessly. He checked the tires, trying to figure out a way to get them to grip, but the snow was just too thick. For a moment he stood there, staring at the car, wondering what to do next. He had a shovel in his truck, but it wasn't going to make much of a difference in this kind of snowstorm. Still, he had to try something. He ran back to his truck, grabbed the shovel and started digging around the tires, trying to clear the snow. It was hard work, and the cold was making it even harder to focus. But he didn't give up. He kept digging, feeling the snow pile higher and higher until his hands were numb and his back was aching. As he dug, he noticed that the elderly man was still sitting quietly in the car, watching him. His face was pale and he looked exhausted. The young man's frustration grew. The storm wasn't letting up, and every minute that passed, the snow seemed to get deeper. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. The old man couldn't stay out here much longer. Finally, after what felt like hours, the young man managed to clear enough snow to give the tires some traction. He ran back to the front of the car and asked the old man to try starting the engine again. The elderly man did as he was told, and the car sputtered, then revved, and finally, miraculously, the wheels began to turn. "Yes, we're almost there," the young man shouted, his voice filled with relief. With a little more maneuvering, the car slowly edged free from the snowbank. The elderly man's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. "I thought I was done for," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you." The young man smiled, feeling a rush of pride. "No problem. Just glad I could help." But the storm wasn't over yet. As soon as the car was free, the young man looked at the road ahead. It was still covered in snow, and he knew it wouldn't be easy to drive through. The wind howled around them, and the visibility was almost zero. The roads were icy, and if the old man tried to drive alone, there was a good chance he would end up stuck again, or worse, stranded out in the cold with no one around to help. "Look, it's not safe to drive in this," the young man said, his voice steady but urgent. You need to get out of this storm and fast. The elderly man nodded, his face now a mixture of relief and exhaustion. I know, he muttered, but I don't know what to do. I'm not sure how to get home. The young man thought for a moment. He couldn't just let the elderly man wander off in the storm. They were miles from the nearest town, and with the weather like this, it could be hours before anyone else passed by. You can't stay out here, the young man said. I'll take you to the nearest inn. It's just a few miles down the road. We can ride it out there until the storm clears up. The elderly man hesitated, looking down at the ground. I don't want to be a bother. The young man shook his head. You're not a bother. It's the least I can do. Without another word, the elderly man slowly climbed out of the car, careful not to slip on the icy ground. The young man helped him steady himself, and together they made their way back to the truck. As the storm raged around them, they both climbed into the warmth of the truck's cabin. The young man started the engine, and they set off down the road, the snow still falling in thick sheets. The elderly man sat quietly beside him, staring out the window. The young man focused on the road, his mind swirling with thoughts. He didn't know who this old man was or why he was out here alone in the storm, but one thing was clear. He had just made a choice that would change the course of both of their lives. The truck rumbled through the snow-covered road, its tires crunching against the icy surface. The young man kept his focus on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting to the elderly man sitting next to him. The storm outside howled in waves, shaking the truck with each gust of wind. But inside the vehicle it was warm. The heat from the truck's engine slowly thawed their cold, stiff bodies. The old man hadn't spoken much since they left the car behind. He sat quietly, staring out the window at the swirling snow, his face reflecting a deep weariness. The young man couldn't help but notice how fragile the elderly man seemed, like the storm outside could easily sweep him away. He felt a sense of responsibility growing within him, a desire to make sure the man was safe, to get him out of the storm no matter what. The drive was slow. The snow hadn't stopped falling, and the road was slick with ice. The wind whipped through the trees, bending them to the ground. Visibility was still low, and the young man found himself squinting into the darkness, searching for any signs of the road or the upcoming inn. He glanced over at the old man from time to time. How far is the inn from here? The elderly man finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it much in the past few hours. Not far, the young man replied, trying to sound confident. Maybe 10 more minutes. Just hang on a little longer. The old man nodded, but there was something in his eyes that told the young man he wasn't sure if he'd make it that long. He seemed to be fighting off exhaustion, his eyelids heavy and his body slumped against the seat. The young man couldn't help but wonder how long the old man had been stranded in the snow before he showed up. You doing all right? The young man asked, his voice quieter now. You're looking pretty worn out. The elderly man let out a long sigh. I've been better, he said, his voice tinged with the faintest hint of humor. But I'll make it. Just need to rest for a bit. The young man didn't press further, but he could see the strain in the older man's face. He had the feeling that this wasn't just about the cold or the storm. It was something more. Something that had been building up over time. But he didn't ask. Not yet. They drove on in silence, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional scrape of the snow against the truck's undercarriage. The storm raged on outside, but inside the truck it was almost peaceful, almost. Every now and then the young man's thoughts wandered back to the accident they had just escaped. He had always been cautious, always thinking ahead, but today the storm had come too fast. The road had turned treacherous in a matter of minutes, and they'd both been lucky to make it out of the snowbank at all. Do you come this way often? The elderly man asked, his voice breaking the quiet again. Yeah, the young man answered. I live a little outside town. I take this road when I need to head into town for work. Nothing fancy? The old man nodded, but the young man could tell his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't really paying attention to the conversation. It was like he was trying to focus on something else, something more important. The young man turned his attention back to the road, eyes narrowing as he searched for any sign of the inn. The snow was thick now and everything looked the same, just white, endless snow. But then in the distance he saw the flicker of lights, small but visible against the dark night. Looks like we're almost there, the young man said, pointing toward the lights. Hang in there. The elderly man nodded again, but this time his eyes were more focused. I'm grateful for your help, he said. his voice softer now, like he was speaking to himself more than to the young man. "It's no problem," the young man replied quickly. "It's the least I could do. You'd do the same for me." The old man looked over at him, his expression unreadable. "I would," he said simply. The truck slowed as they approached the small inn. Its lights flickered warmly through the storm, a beacon of safety in the middle of the snow-covered wilderness. The young man carefully guided the truck into the small parking lot, his heart easing as he realized they'd made it. They were out of the worst of it. The young man turned off the engine and opened the door, stepping out into the cold again. The wind hit him like a slap, but he didn't mind it. It wasn't nearly as bad as it had been earlier. He quickly moved to the other side of the truck and opened the door for the elderly man. The old man hesitated for a moment before stepping out, but once his feet hit the ground, he seemed steady enough. The young man helped him toward the entrance of the inn, where the warmth from inside greeted them like a hug. The innkeeper, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, looked up from behind the desk and smiled when she saw the two of them. "Good evening, you two," she said, her voice warm. "I didn't expect anyone to come in tonight. The storm's been so bad I thought everyone would be staying put." The young man returned the smile. "We're just passing through. We need a place to stay for the night." Of course," the innkeeper replied, her smile never fading. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. The storm looks like it's going to last a while." The young man helped the elderly man into a chair near the fireplace, where the warmth from the fire seemed to give him a little more life. The old man sank into the chair gratefully, his shoulders relaxing as the warmth enveloped him. The young man went to the counter to check in. He glanced back at the elderly man as he filled out the form, noticing that he was staring into the fire, lost in thought. There was something about him, something quiet, almost peaceful. Yet there was a sadness there too, something that lingered behind his calm exterior. "Here's your key," the innkeeper said, pulling the young man from his thoughts. "Room 4, it's the last one available." The young man took the key and walked back over to the elderly man, who was now looking much more comfortable. "Let's get you settled in," the young man said gently. "You need some rest." The elderly man nodded, his face softening with a tired smile. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you tonight." "Like I said, it's no problem," the young man replied. "Just glad I was able to help." They made their way up the stairs to the room, and the young man settled the old man into bed, making sure he had everything he needed. The elderly man seemed to relax more as the minutes passed, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. Before leaving, the young man turned to the elderly man. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." The old man looked up at him and smiled faintly. "I'll be all right. You've done more than enough. Thank you." The young man nodded and quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. As he made his way back downstairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night, this storm, had brought him something more than just a chance encounter. There was something about the old man that made him wonder. Something that made him feel like this wasn't just a simple act of kindness, but the beginning of something much bigger. The morning after the storm was calm. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world outside blanketed in a soft, quiet white. The young man awoke early, as he usually did. He stretched, feeling the warmth of the inn's room around him. It was quiet, and for a moment he let himself savor the peace. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a while he didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. He got dressed and went downstairs to the small dining area of the inn. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, making his stomach growl. The elderly man was already sitting at a table by the window, looking out at the snowy landscape. He looked more rested than he had the night before, though still weary, as if the storm had drained him in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Good morning," the young man said, walking over to the table. "How are you feeling?" The elderly man looked up with a faint smile. "Better, thank you," he replied. "The rest helped. It's a good thing we made it here last night." "Yeah," the young man agreed, sitting down across from him. "I wasn't sure if we would. The storm was pretty bad." "It was," the old man said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "But sometimes things happen for a reason. Maybe that storm was meant to bring us together." The young man looked at him, his curiosity piqued. He hadn't expected the old man to say something like that. "What do you mean?" he asked. The elderly man leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant for a moment. "I've lived a long life," he began slowly, "and I've learned that the most unexpected things often lead to the most important moments. You helped me last night. You didn't have to, but you did. And that's not something I forget easily." The young man didn't know how to respond to that. It felt like the old man was saying something deeper, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to understand it. They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them sipping their coffee, letting the warmth from the mug spread through them. The elderly man broke the silence again. "You mentioned you work outside of town. What do you do?" The young man hesitated for a second, unsure of how to explain. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I work on cars, trucks, anything that needs fixing. Not glamorous, but it pays the bills." The old man nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like honest work," he said. "The kind of work that keeps people going day in and day out." "It does," the young man replied. "Sometimes it feels like it's all I can do, just keep my head above water, but, it's something. Something is better than nothing," the elderly man said, his voice firm but kind. "I've always believed that. If you're doing something that's worthwhile, then you're on the right track, no matter how small it may seem." The young man couldn't help but feel like there was something more to the old man's words. It was like he wasn't just talking about work. He was talking about life. The way the old man spoke was filled with wisdom, like he'd seen things, understood things that the young man hadn't even begun to grasp. "Thanks," the young man said, not sure what else to say. "I try to do my best." "You're doing more than just getting by," the elderly man said. "You're helping people. That's something valuable." The young man felt a little uncomfortable with the praise. He wasn't used to being noticed for the little things he did. "I'm just trying to make a living, he said, shrugging. "Nothing fancy." The elderly man smiled knowingly. "It's the little things that matter. Helping someone when they need it, no matter how small the action seems. It all adds up in the end." The young man sat quietly, mulling over the old man's words. He had never really thought of it that way. He'd always felt like he was stuck in a routine, just trying to make ends meet. But hearing the elderly man talk made him wonder if there was more to life than just working to survive. What if the small things, the simple acts of kindness, the moments where you helped someone just because it was the right thing to do, actually mattered more than anything else? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the innkeeper walking in with a tray of breakfast. She set it down in front of them with a warm smile. "Here you go," she said. "I made a little something special today since we have guests." The young man smiled at her. "Thank you." The elderly man nodded as well, and they both dug into their food. The conversation drifted to lighter topics, how long the inn had been around, the weather, the storm. But the young man couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was meant to understand. The way the old man talked, the way he looked at things, he seemed to know something that the young man didn't. And that thought kept nagging at him, like there was a lesson in there somewhere, waiting for him to figure it out. After breakfast, the two of them sat back for a while, enjoying the last of their coffee. The storm had cleared, and the sun was starting to break through the clouds, casting a pale light over the snow-covered landscape. The young man was getting ready to leave. He had work to do back in town, and the day was already slipping away. "Well, I guess I should be heading out," the young man said, standing up and stretching. "I've got some things to take care of." The elderly man looked up at him, his eyes sharp and clear. "Before you go," he said, "I'd like to give you something." The young man raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You don't have to—" "I insist," the elderly man interrupted. "I've been thinking about it, and I want to offer you something. You've helped me, and I want to return the favor." The young man felt a little uncomfortable. "I didn't help you for anything in return," he said quickly. "You don't owe me anything." The elderly man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was more like he understood something the young man didn't yet. "It's not about owing anything," he said. "It's about the principle of it. You did something kind for a stranger, and now I want to do something kind for you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "If you ever need anything, advice, opportunities, whatever it may be, don't hesitate to call me. I can help you." The young man looked at the card, then back at the elderly man. His mind raced. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," the old man replied gently. "Just remember, when the time comes, you'll have a choice, and I'm offering you a chance." The young man didn't fully understand what the old man meant, but there was something about the sincerity in his voice that made him take the card. He pocketed it, still unsure of what to make of it. "Thank you," the young man said, his voice quieter than before. I'll keep it in mind. The elderly man nodded. Good, now go on. The world's waiting for you. With that, the young man turned and walked out of the inn, the door closing behind him with a soft creak. The snow was still thick on the ground, but the day was brighter now, the sun trying to push through the clouds. As he made his way back to his truck, he couldn't help but feel that something had changed. Something in the air and the way he thought about things. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that his encounter with the elderly man wasn't just a coincidence. It was the beginning of something. The days that followed were filled with routine. The young man went back to his usual life, working on cars, fixing what was broken and doing what needed to be done to make ends meet. He hadn't expected the encounter with the elderly man to stick with him as much as it did. But it did. The words the old man had spoken echoed in his mind, especially the offer to reach out if he ever needed anything. He hadn't thought much about it at first. After all, what could someone like him, someone with his life, his struggles, need from a man who seemed so far removed from his world? But the more he thought about it, the more curious he became. The old man had to have been more than just a regular stranger. There was something about him that had felt different, like he saw the world in a way that most people didn't. And then, one evening, while sitting at home after a long day of work, the young man found himself staring at the business card the elderly man had given him. It had been tucked away in his wallet for days, forgotten at first, but now it seemed to call out to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about that moment, something bigger than just a casual act of kindness. His fingers hovered over the card. He could hear his own doubts in his mind. What would I even say? What could he possibly do for me? But something pushed him to reach for the phone anyway. He stared at the number on the card for a few moments longer, then dialed it. It rang a few times before a deep, calm voice answered on the other end. Hello? It was the elderly man's voice. Hi, the young man said, feeling a bit awkward. I don't know if you remember me, but we met a few days ago. You were stuck in the snow and I helped you get to the inn. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the elderly man spoke again. Of course I remember you. How are you? Is everything all right? The young man hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. I've been okay, he said. I've just been thinking a lot about what you said. About making choices and helping others, you know? I guess I just wanted to reach out, see if there's something more to all of this. The elderly man's voice softened, almost as if he understood exactly what the young man was feeling. I'm glad you called. I think you're beginning to see what I was trying to tell you. Life has a way of offering opportunities when you least expect it, but it's up to us to recognize them. The young man sat back in his chair listening. There was something comforting about the elderly man's voice, a calm wisdom that made him feel like everything might just work out, even if he didn't know how. I don't know where to start, the young man admitted. I feel like I'm stuck. Every day is the same, work, go home, repeat. I've got bills to pay and it's like I'm just trying to keep my head above water. The elderly man was quiet for a moment. You're not alone in feeling that way, he said finally. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day grind, but sometimes a small change can make a big difference. Tell me, what is it you truly want? What's the one thing you would do if you weren't held back by fear or doubt? The question caught the young man off guard. He had never really thought about it before. He'd always been focused on survival, on getting through each day. But now, with the elderly man's words hanging in the air, he found himself asking that very question. I don't know, he said, his voice soft. I guess I've always wanted something more, something different than this. Working for others, fixing broken things. I've always had an idea for a business, something of my own, but it feels impossible. I don't have the resources, the experience. I don't even know where to start. The elderly man chuckled gently. No one ever does. But that's where the opportunity lies. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about taking the first step, no matter how small it seems. It's about having the courage to start, even when you don't know the outcome. The young man was quiet for a long moment, considering the words. The idea of starting his own business, something he had dreamt about for years, suddenly felt less impossible. He still didn't know how he could make it work, but there was something in the old man's voice that made him believe it was possible. Do you think it's too late for me? The young man asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. I'm not young anymore. I'm already in my 30s. Is it too late to start something new? The elderly man's voice was steady and confident. It's never too late. You're still in the prime of your life. And if you're willing to put in the effort, there's no reason you can't build something that will last. The key is to start now, not later. Time moves quickly, and the longer you wait, the harder it becomes. The young man felt a surge of hope. He had never heard anyone speak to him like that before. He had always been so focused on his limitations, his lack of resources, but the elderly man was showing him a different perspective. "I don't even know where to begin," the young man admitted. "Start small," the elderly man advised. "Think about the skills you already have. What is it that people need? What can you offer that's unique? Start there, and then build on it." The young man took a deep breath. "I guess I've always been good at fixing things. I've always enjoyed working on cars, making them run better, solving problems. Maybe I could start a small repair shop, something local, something people trust." The elderly man's voice warmed. "That's a great idea. You have the skills, and there's always a need for good, honest work. Now it's just about finding a way to get started. Don't be afraid to take that first step, and don't be afraid to ask for help along the way." The young man felt a sense of excitement begin to build inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could make this dream a reality. But there was one thing he still wasn't sure about. How do I get the resources? I don't have a lot of money to invest. How do I even begin to make this happen? The elderly man paused, then answered in a calm, measured tone. "I can help with that. I've been around long enough to know that starting a business isn't about having all the money in the world. It's about having a solid plan, the right connections, and a willingness to learn. Let me help you get started. We'll talk through your ideas, figure out what's realistic, and then we'll go from there." The young man's heart raced. He couldn't believe it. The elderly man was offering to help him, to guide him through this process. It felt like a dream, but it also felt like something he couldn't turn down. "Thank you," the young man said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't even know what to say. This means a lot." "You don't need to say anything," the elderly man replied with a chuckle. "Just take that first step and we'll go from there. You've got potential. Don't waste it." The call ended shortly after that, and the young man sat in silence for a while, letting the words sink in. He had just been offered something he never thought he'd get. A real chance. It felt like the beginning of something important. Something that could change the course of his life. He didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he was on the right path. The next few weeks flew by faster than the young man could keep up with. He had never felt so alive with possibility. Every day he woke up with a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. The plans he had discussed with the elderly man began to take shape, one small step at a time. Every morning he would spend time planning, sketching out ideas for the business, trying to figure out the best way to start. The elderly man had kept his word. He guided him through every part of the process, giving advice and offering insights that the young man never would have thought of on his own. They talked about everything. The costs involved, the equipment he'd need, the kind of shop he could run. The elderly man didn't just give him advice about business. He also gave him advice about life. His words always seemed to cut through the noise of the young man's doubts. "Don't be afraid to fail," the elderly man told him during one of their conversations. "Failure isn't the end. It's a lesson. Every successful person has failed at some point. What matters is how you rise after the fall." Those words stuck with the young man, especially as he faced some of the early challenges of setting up his business. There were days when he felt like giving up. The paperwork was complicated, the costs were higher than he'd anticipated, and finding a location for his shop was taking longer than he'd hoped. But every time he felt discouraged, he remembered the elderly man's words. He would push through, step by step. One afternoon, after a long day of dealing with the logistics of starting his business, the young man sat in his truck outside the small building he had rented for the shop. The place wasn't much, just a small garage with a worn-down floor and peeling walls. But it was his. It was the first real step toward his dream, and that thought alone made the young man's heart swell with pride. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone rang. It was the elderly man. "Hey, how's it going?" the young man answered, trying to sound cheerful even though he was feeling worn out. "Is everything on track?" the elderly man asked, his voice as calm as ever. "Yeah, it's getting there," the young man replied. "I've got the place rented and I've started getting some equipment together. It's just a lot more than I thought it would be, you know?" The elderly man chuckled softly. It's always more than you think it will be. But that's the beauty of it. You're building something from the ground up. That takes time, but it also takes patience. The work you put in now will pay off in the end. The young man smiled at the thought. I guess I needed to hear that today. It's hard not to get discouraged when things don't happen as quickly as you want them to. That's the thing about dreams, the elderly man said. They're not always meant to come together overnight. But if you stick with it little by little, you'll see it grow. And when you look back, you'll realize how far you've come. After the call, the young man felt a renewed sense of determination. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was starting to believe that this could really work. He was building something he could be proud of, something that would give him the independence he had always wanted. A few weeks later, the shop was finally ready to open. It wasn't perfect. There were still some things that needed to be finished, and the space was small, but it was his. It was the start of something new, and he could feel the excitement building in his chest. He had never been more nervous and excited at the same time. This was it, the moment he had been working toward. The first few days were slow. He didn't have many customers, and the work was harder than he had imagined. But he didn't let it get to him. He focused on what he could control, doing the best job he could for every person who walked through the door. Slowly, word began to spread that there was a new mechanic in town who could be trusted to do good work. And as more people came in, more people told their friends. The shop started to pick up steam. One afternoon, after working on a car for several hours, the young man was wiping his hands on a rag when the door to the shop opened. He looked up to see the elderly man standing in the doorway, a big smile on his face. Well, look at this, the elderly man said, walking in. It looks like you're making it happen. The young man grinned. Yeah, it's coming along. It's a lot of work, but I'm getting there. The elderly man nodded, his eyes glinting with approval. I knew you would. I told you. The key is to just keep going. Don't let anything stop you. The young man wiped his hands again and walked over to shake the elderly man's hand. I couldn't have done it without your help. You were the one who made me believe this was possible. The elderly man gave him a knowing smile. You always had it in you. I just helped you see it. Now you're the one making it happen. For a moment they stood there in the quiet of the shop, the sound of the workday settling around them. It was a moment of calm in the midst of the chaos, and it felt good. The young man felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had led him to this point. It had been hard, but it had been worth it. You're doing great, the elderly man said, his voice filled with pride. I can see it. This place is going to be something special. The young man smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest at the elderly man's words. Thank you. I'm starting to believe that too. As the days turned into weeks, the shop continued to grow. The young man found himself busier than ever, fixing cars, taking on new projects, and slowly building a reputation for himself. The work wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. He was creating something that had value, something that people trusted. The elderly man continued to offer advice and encouragement whenever the young man needed it. He would call now and then, checking in, offering his wisdom and reminding him not to lose sight of the bigger picture. Even when the young man felt overwhelmed by the demands of the business, he knew he wasn't alone. One evening, as the young man was closing up shop for the night, he sat down at his desk and looked around. The space that had once felt empty and uncertain now felt full of promise, full of potential. He had come so far in such a short amount of time. He picked up the business card the elderly man had given him all those weeks ago, the same one he had kept in his wallet ever since that first meeting. He ran his fingers over the edges, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. Without the elderly man's guidance, he might never have had the courage to take the first step, but now he was doing it. He had built something from nothing, and it was working. The door to the shop opened with a soft chime, and the young man looked up to see the elderly man standing there once again. This time he wasn't alone. He was with a woman who looked to be in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This is my daughter, the elderly man said, introducing the woman. She's been in the business world for years. I thought she might be able to offer some advice on how you can take things to the next level. The young man stood up, feeling a bit overwhelmed but grateful. I don't know what to say. Thank you for all your help already. I'm just getting started, the elderly man smiled. You've done more than that. Now it's time to go even further. And with that, The next chapter of the young man's journey began, one that would take him further than he ever thought possible, all because of a chance encounter in a snowstorm, a simple act of kindness, and a belief that something bigger was waiting for him.